So somebody wrote, being woke means you care about people regardless of their gender, race, or sexual orientation. What does that have to do with a corn star conservatives are so twisted about? Well, I made a video where I said the end point of wokeism, if you're truly tolerant, is you would essentially sleep with anybody who approached you. You wouldn't be being tolerant if you said no, because you'd be rejecting them on some level. So I was just taking it to, its logical extreme. But I really want to challenge you on this idea that being woke means you care about people regardless of their gender, race, or sexual orientation. What do you think as a woke person about white straight men? What do you think about them? What do you think about whiteness? What do you think about people who are conservative? Do you really care about people? I would suggest you don't. And I'll say that not in a mean way, because I know a lot of woke people and I know you're trying to do those things. I know you're trying to be a caring person. But you see, what happens in political extremism is very often what you consciously think you're doing, you're actually unconsciously doing the opposite. So I've always said unconscious racism does exist. It's a real thing. It's a real phenomenon. But the people engaging in it the most are clearly on the left, saying you're anti-racist and then making derogatory comments about whiteness or white people. I mean, it's so obvious to people who are on the outside looking at woke people. It's just, we see it, okay? And a lot of what you considered latent racism or unconscious racism on the right, like people who believed in colorblindness or valuing the individual or meritocracy, when you said, well, that's unconscious racism, we go, what are you talking about, right? You're seeing things that don't exist. So you were seeing unconscious racism where it wasn't, and we were seeing unconscious racism where it was, which was in the woke. Now, we are starting to see actual racism on the right, growing racism on the right, and I'm with you in fighting against that. But if you're a truly, good person, you have to resort back to Enlightenment principles, that everyone is created equal, that we don't judge people on their appearance, and we judge them essentially by the way their brain functions, what they think, right? Their philosophy. So if you're truly a caring and kind person, you judge people based on their ideology. And hopefully their ideology is some mix of these Enlightenment values that, again, I say again because I talk about this all the time, that America did not live up to at its founding, but at least had those Enlightenment principles, those universal principles in their founding documentation. We had to live up to those. We didn't do it at first, and it's to our ever-dying shame that we didn't. But just because we didn't live up to them doesn't mean those principles are somehow tainted. They're not. I know a lot of woke people say, well, how can we believe in Enlightenment principles when that people who believed in the Enlightenment and who founded our country believed in slavery? And, well, for instance, Isaac Newton, genius, right? He also believed in something like a Bible code, okay? He believed in alchemy and things like that. So if you study the Enlightenment period, right? Not like mystical Enlightenment, but like the Enlightenment period in when our country was founded, you find a lot of really crazy ideas were around at the time. They still didn't understand why there were seashells on the top of mountains. They thought it was from the flood, right? So there were a lot of crazy ideas at the time, but they also stumbled upon universal truths. And you say, well, if they were that crazy, how could they have found like universal truths? Well, again, Isaac Newton was a little crazy in some of his beliefs, but he found universal truths related to physics. I think we found political as well as economic truths around the time of the Enlightenment. Political truths would be this representative democracy with checks and balances, right? And economics would be Adam Smith, the free market, etc. So we found these universal truths about politics and economics, not as provable as physics truths, right? But still, as time has gone on, we see how powerful America is. And whenever America goes the wrong way, we start to resort back to judging people by their race or gender or violating certain economic truths. We start to drift towards socialism or communism. The great thing about the founding of America, and I'll finish with this, is where the right goes too far is it starts to become nationalism instead of patriotism. When the country is functioning right, when we embody those high ideals, those universal ideals, those principles that kind of exist platonically outside of the world, when we start to align with those, you naturally love your country. You have a patriotism, okay? So I want to see patriotism rather than nationalism. And instead of woke, I want to see the traditional liberals who stand up for universal rights, who go back to those founding principles which include things like meritocracy, free markets, freedom of speech, so on and so forth. And I do think you can also, it's also, the traditional left used to want a safety net, like an economic safety net. They used to push for that. And I thought that's a legitimate function. But the traditional liberals I knew in the 90s, they wanted that economic safety net, but they were aware of the road to serfdom, which means, you start taxing people excessively. It's kind of it's a kind of strain of socialism, and they were leery of that. So they respected capitalism more. But the woke, and there's don't even get me started on the alt right, but the woke, they're undermining universal principles, they're undermining economic universal principles, and I don't think woke means what you think it means. I think you think it means that, but it actually in action is something different.